What's up guys, it's Bromley. Today we're going to talk about fundamentals of programming, specifically as it pertains to variety. Now this is something that everybody's heard if they've been training for more than a couple months, that you train in a specific threshold for so long and eventually you got to switch it up, right? Even if you're applying progressive overload, which is consistently increasing the stress in a way that keeps your body adapting, if you just progress by making your workouts harder and harder in the same threshold with the same movement, same amount of volume, eventually diminished returns set in. So you have to have an intelligent plan on shifting your training, on changing the tone of your training so that you can keep progressing. Now, periodization is one of the more well-known methods of doing that. And while periodization is effective, I think it confuses a lot of people. The important thing to know about periodization, if it works and why it works, it's simply that you're putting your training into different periods where different stressors are considered and prioritized in each one. So by arranging them in an intelligent fashion, you can actually keep progress going much longer. Now, periodization has a context of being applied specifically to competition. While you don't need to compete, you can still benefit from this arrangement of training that keeps stagnation at bay and keeps diminished returns from preventing progress. So the model I used for variety to make good training decisions, so we're not just guessing, is SRN. SRN covers specificity, recovery, and novelty. Those are the three things you want to consider when you're making changes so that those changes can be focused and intelligent. Now I put them in a triangle here because they're all connected. So changing one has implications for any of the other two. So they all overlap, they're all connected. Now a good example is training volumes. Let's consider training volume for a second. If you are training with relatively low volume, meaning you're only doing a few sets, let's say the weight's pretty heavy, the reps are low, you're in a very strength specific range, then you're talking about, let's say, doing triples around 85% and you're only doing a couple of sets, so it's pretty low volume. Well, if you move to a higher volume method of training, if you're doing more sets, specifically at a higher rep range with less weight on the bar, that is going to represent a novel stimulus. So that's change just for the sake of it. Now, if you don't have very directed training goals, you have a lot of play in the joints. You can make a lot of changes that are just novelty. They're just different for the sake of it. But let's consider how novelty affects recovery. Now, as you move to those higher rep ranges and that higher volume, you'll find you get very sore much faster because you're sensitive to it. It's a new stimulus. You're also going to find that as fatigue builds up, you're still getting better week to week because you're progressing to that new rep range and you're adapting to that new amount of volume. So because it was a novel stimulus, you grow quickly, but also notice that recovery drops. More volume means you have a harder time recovering, which means that as the workouts go on, that you find yourself feeling a little more tired, a little more beat up. You find that fatigue grows much faster within the workouts, that you're not as fresh into later sets, that local fatigue builds up, you get that burning sensation as you get into that lactic threshold. So recovery drops a bit with that higher volume. Also notice that from a specificity standpoint, going to higher volume takes you further away from what you would be doing if you were preparing for a powerlifting meet. So those two different types of training have a different tone as far as how specific they are to, let's say, maximal strength. Now, instead, if you were getting ready for something like a CrossFit event, or let's say you were getting ready for an NFL bench press combine test, let's say you were getting ready for a strongman contest where there's a lot of volume of work, a lot of different exercises. In that instance, that volume might actually be more specific to what you're doing depending on the threshold you're working in. So specificity is completely arbitrary. It depends on the task that you're talking about. Most of us are looking towards long-term strength, so we can see the volume is a little less specific. So one of the questions I get with regards to base and peak phases, because base strength is written primarily to cover the differences between phases of training, making something like periodization a little more understandable, a little more palatable. One of the common questions I get is, if you are not getting ready for a contest or if you don't compete, should you do a peak phase? So the easy answer is absolutely. I talk about a peak phase as something that specifically directs you towards one task. So your attention gets a little more focused towards one variable and you try to build skill in that variable, where the base phase is more about building up all of the surrounding qualities that contribute to that variable. So for most of us, that's strength. Non-specific base type qualities include building muscle, increasing capacity, building general coordination, rounding out weak muscles, and so on. So that's what we encompass in a base phase. So if we're looking at the SRN model, a base phase is going to be a little less specific to strength, so percentages are lower, reps are higher, more total volume. Recovery is going to be a little bit lower, so we plan on increasing recovery as the weight gets higher so that we can express that strength. That's how an actual contest peak works. but that doesn't work if you have no volume to reduce. So we start with a little less recovery, we do more work, and we build up fatigue. That's one of the ways that the base phase works, and that represents novelty, so that when we move into a peak phase, we get the benefit of dropping the volume down. So the increase in weight is more specific, the recovery is more specific, but it also allows that newfound strength to be expressed, and you get novelty because now you're training in a different rep range. So regardless of whether it's specific or not, novel stimuli causes a resurgence of newbie gains. You're now sensitive to that stimulus because you haven't been training it before, which means you grow exponentially faster. So all these three things go together to give you some really keen insight into exactly how to arrange your training phases. It doesn't have to follow a strict block periodization scheme. It doesn't have to follow a very clean linear scheme. All you have to do is conceptualize a certain period of time where you're focusing on one element, which is the base qualities, and another period of time where you transition into something that is more peak oriented. That's about it. It's pretty straightforward. So to give you an example, I'm going into my peak phase. It's not my actual contest peak. That's about 6 to 8 weeks that I spend on very, very specific events and training thresholds. So an actual contest peak hinges on getting ready for one specific goal, and that's only really necessary when you have something really important coming up. If you want to plan weeks of training around one thing, it's usually just a contest. Now, for those of you who aren't competing, you still want to go through these peak phases. So for my peak phase that happens several months before my actual contest peak, I'm still moving into something that's a little more specific, and I'm still making these changes that represent novelty. So I already built up this base where I was doing a lot of repeating sets. I specifically like to volumize, which means I'm adding sets week to week, and it means that I'm adapting to more volume. That also means fatigue builds up really quick. So my main lift was increasing my triples, going from 3x3 to 4x3 to 5x3, and then resetting with a little more weight, building up again. It's almost a form of step loading. And my accessory was doing the same in a slightly higher rep range. Now switching into my peak phase, I'm now just doing 2 sets. I'm going for one top set, and then I'm dropping the weight down and doing a high rep AMRAP. And I'm doing that for pretty much all of my compound movements. So what does that represent? That represents a novel stress, that represents an increase in recovery because I'm not doing as much work, and that represents more specificity to what I'm getting ready for. So I already feel I did my first peak workout where I did a top triple on box squats, and then I dropped 10% and did an AMRAP, and I got 10 reps, and I can tell you that I am still sore. And I've been squatting weekly for about 3 months now. So I can tell you that this absolutely works. And when you time it correctly, you're going to see how this shift in training can actually immediately recreate a new surge of progress. This is just a pretty easy way to conceptualize that variety. Base and peak, remember, they're just 2 broad phases of training. They could be 8 weeks, they could be 20 weeks. The idea is to spend some time getting good at one. You want to do this, you want to work the same threshold long enough to actually see progress and feel like you got good at it. And then you shift in this quantum leap upwards where the weight suddenly increases, effort suddenly increases. That's where the real growth happens. But it doesn't work if you're training the same threshold indefinitely year round. You have to get good at scheduling variety. And that's really the backbone of periodization. So hopefully this gave you guys some insight. If you have any questions about this, or you have any questions about base strength, the book goes into this a lot deeper, but go ahead and leave any questions you have in the comment box and I'll get to them. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.